I've had an undo button on my Gmail for the past 20 years or so. I don't know how many times that thing has saved my ass. We're incredibly lucky to live with so many safety nets. You buy something you can't actually afford, the store has a 30-day return policy. You make a massive mistake at work. It's embarrassing, but you can usually apologize, put in some extra hours, and fix it. Even our relationships often have a built-in reset. You have a bad argument, you cool off, and you try again the next day. So much of our modern life is fixable that it trains us to be casual. We start acting like every mistake can be repaired with enough time, effort, or money. We get comfortable winging it. But there are still realities in life where that undo button just doesn't exist. There's no return policy on a terrible physical injury. You can't unrupture an artery, and you can't unstart a war. In these rare, high-stakes arenas, making a casual decision isn't just a bump in the road. It's a permanent destination. Today, we're talking about what it means to recognize those moments. We're looking at a passage from the Analects about the areas of life where you have to completely drop the casual attitude, slow down, and treat the situation with absolute gravity. Exploring the Analects, Episode 18. Passage 7.13. No undo button for life. Hey folks, this is Elliot Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for Episode 18 of Exploring the Analects. In this episode, we'll be covering Passage 7.13 of the Analects, a 7-character phrase about when to be heedful. As always, I'll read the passage in Chinese and English, explain the ideas behind it and provide some historical context, and then analyze the language found in the passage as a way to learn new words and phrases in classical Chinese and modern Mandarin. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button. No matter how you follow, I always appreciate likes and shares. Or maybe you know someone who'd enjoy the show. If so, don't forget to tell them about it next time you talk. As always, you can follow along with the episode guide on analects.net, where you'll find all the Chinese terms in this episode, as well as a newly revamped full text of the Analects. All right, let's get started. I'll begin by reading the passage in a modern Mandarin pronunciation, followed by my English translation. 7.13. 子之所慎，斋、战、疾. What the master was most heedful of: ritual cleansing, warfare, and illness. I had my annual physical the other day. The doctor reviewed my blood work and told me he wants to put me on statins. My cholesterol and triglycerides aren't great, so whether or not I'd go on statins has been an open conversation for a bit. I took the past year, made some changes to my diet, and said to myself, if that didn't do the trick, I'd listen to what the doctor had to say about the medication. So that's what I did. He told me a couple things I didn't know about statins. For one thing, they reduce inflammation in addition to lowering cholesterol. So there's more than one way that they slow the buildup of plaque in the arteries. I found another point even more interesting. Statins stabilize arterial plaque, which is counterintuitively a good thing. He told me that most heart attacks occur when arterial plaque destabilizes and ruptures. So you want to keep in place whatever plaque is there. Funny thing, just a few days before my conversation with my doctor, I was sitting at the barbershop waiting for a haircut. Someone was talking about how his doctor wanted to prescribe him statins. He said he refused. Now, I don't want to go into why he refused, since I wouldn't want to spread misinformation. But when it came down to it, just like me, he was worried about very serious diseases that anyone in their right mind would want to avoid. We both realized you don't get a second chance with this stuff, and we figured you better do the right thing. I heeded the advice of my doctor, and he did the same, just with Dr. YouTube. Anyway, let's dig into passage 713 and learn a bit about Confucius's take on heedfulness. First off, I thought it's worth pointing out how 7.13 is really a complete 180 from the passage we covered in the last episode, 6.25. That passage is cryptic and metaphorical. This passage is formulaic and straightforward. Just as a refresher, here's 6.25. A goo that's not a goo. What a goo. What a goo. If you have no idea what that means, all I can blame you for is not listening to episode 17. But the point is, nobody in today's world is going to understand that passage right off the bat. But looking at passage 7.13, it's the exact opposite. It's really transparent. I'm sure you can already come up with 10 reasons why Confucius would be heedful when it came to topics like war and illness. Anyone in their right mind would realize how serious we should be when it comes to those topics. They're matters of life and death. This isn't the only passage we see like this either. You'll frequently come across this specific stylistic formula, a statement about a way Confucius would act, followed by a list of situations in which he'd act that way. In this case, he acts heedfully, and the situations in which he does this is when considering matters of war, illness, and ritual. The next passage I've got queued up, 7.21, does exactly this as well. It states his attitude or demeanor, along with the situations in which it was appropriate. That passage is about topics he was unwilling to discuss. And Book 10 is basically a chapter-length version of this format. So, why does the Analects do this so often? It comes down to a key framework for Confucianism, one that you might call virtue ethics modeling. Let's break that down. Most philosophers agree that the Analects is a book of virtue ethics. If you've ever read Aristotle or St. Thomas Aquinas, you'll know what I'm talking about. Virtue ethics doesn't give you a strict, logical rule book for exactly how to live. Instead, it focuses on character. It asks questions like, what are the best qualities for a person to develop so that they can handle the hard parts of life? The Analects does this by defining a set of virtues or positive qualities, many of which we've already talked about. For example, Ren, human-heartedness, De, moral charisma, and Li, ritual propriety. But the text doesn't just define these virtues. It tries to show them through stories about the lives of real people. It's heavily focused on role ethics, how you act based on your position in society. And Confucius believes the best way to teach isn't through a list of commandments or a meandering philosophical discussion, but through exemplars, role models. My last point before we move on from the framework of this passage and onto the meaning is that among the role models presented in the Analects, there's one who stands out more than any others. And of course, that's Confucius himself. Remember, the Analects wasn't written by Confucius. Kind of like Socrates, he didn't leave a written collection of his own teachings. What we do have is attributed to his disciples, and those disciples made sure that their ultimate role model, the master himself, was the star of the show. Instead of telling you to be heedful, they wanted you to see what it looked like in the hands of a master. So passage 7.13 is just one of many glimpses into values he tried to live by. And the value in focus this time is shèn, or what I've translated above as most heedful. I'll characterize shèn a bit and expand on those two words since they can only do so much on their own. When someone is shèn, they understand the gravity of the thing at hand. They know that making the right decision about what to do is important because making the wrong decision will have terrible consequences. Knowing all of that, they don't try something new just to see what happens. They do what they believe to be right without hesitation. In the context of the Analects, shèn is a virtue, just like ren and de, but because it appears less frequently, we can consider it a relatively minor virtue. That gives us a bit of a puzzle to work with when translating it. Fewer appearances means less context and fewer translations. So I tried to compensate for that. I regularly reference 7 different translations of the Analects, and since shèn appears in 6 passages, I got a chance to see how it was rendered 42 times. I'll spare you most of the details and give you the high-level summary. The virtue of shèn is generally translated as being very careful or exercising great caution. Let's take a look at how I landed on heedful. Here's how shèn is associated with different topics throughout the text of the Analects. It's used to describe how one should engage in funeral preparations, make ritual preparations, take action, engage in war, deal with illness, and speak to others. That last one, speaking, comes up 3 separate times, most pointedly in 19.25. where Confucius's businessman disciple, Zigong, warns that a single word can mark someone as wise or unwise, which he sums up as 言不可不慎也. In other words, one must never be loose or careless with their words. Notice the pattern. Every scenario where shèn appears is one where the consequences of getting it wrong are severe and hard to recover from. This isn't caution in the sense of hanging back. It's almost the opposite. The refusal to be casual or indecisive when you know doing so would be too risky. Passage 8.2 sharpens the picture from the negative angle. There, we learn what happens to someone who has shèn, but does not understand li, or ritual propriety. It turns into what's called xì, or timidness. This is a formula. Heedfulness minus ritual propriety results in timidness. The lesson is that heedfulness needs the boundaries set by ritual to result in decisive action. Without it, when the conscientious person tries to be heedful, they'll be paralyzed and unable to figure out the right thing to do. Think about it like handling an emergency situation. Someone who has regularly trained to perform CPR, which in this case is the ritual, is going to both take the emergency seriously and act decisively. Someone who has little training in CPR might panic or hesitate, no matter how serious they know the situation is. With that picture of someone facing a situation of grave danger, let's move on to the most personal of the three topics listed, G, or illness. This one should be the easiest to understand. When I started taking statins recently, I sat down and quoted those immortal words of the Backstreet Boys to myself. Quit playing games with my heart. Nobody needs more plaque in their arteries. Nobody needs unstable plaque either. And I've got family. I want to be around as long as I can for them. So I said to myself, do I know exactly what else this drug is going to do to me? No. Maybe I'll have muscle pain. Maybe I'll have that so-called brain fog. But reducing risk of a potentially fatal cardiac event, that's worth it. I'll take the medicine. Passage 10.16 presents Confucius in a similar scenario, and he actually ends up taking the position of the guy I overheard at the barber shop, at least on the surface. A powerful noble from his home state presented him with some medicine, ostensibly to show he cared about Confucius's health. Confucius accepted it and respectfully replied, I'm not quite sure of its effects. I dare not taste it. The way I see it, Confucius refused to take the medicine because he didn't believe the gift giver to be an authority on the medicine. Had a medical practitioner done so, maybe he would have acted differently. This is also an example of shèn. He used his best judgment to act decisively in a dangerous situation. Now let's move on to John, or warfare. It's not too difficult to expand our understanding from the individual level risk presented by illness to the population level risk presented by war. This, by the way, is one of the core Confucian modes of argument. First understanding things on a personal level, then projecting the principles increasingly broadly to the interpersonal, societal, political, and spiritual levels. So war presents a grave societal risk, just like illness presents a grave personal risk. In Confucius's time, who was responsible for acting with shèn when presented with the possibility of war? It was the ruler of a state, as well as those advising the ruler. Confucius wasn't strictly against war, but he also didn't believe might makes right. He believed it was a moral imperative to wage war when it was just and avoid war when it was unjust. Here's a couple of examples that show this Confucian attitude toward war. The first is from the Mencius, passage 1b 10.3. This is from the Van Noorden. For a state of 10,000 chariots to invade another state of 10,000 chariots, those people then welcomed that king with baskets of food and pots of soup. What other leader could they have? But if they flee you, like fleeing water and fire, as if you were deeper than water and hotter than fire, then they will simply reject you. In other words, if two rulers have equal military might, but one cares for the people while the other is cruel, his war will be justified as a liberation of those oppressed. Without that care, even a military victory will be futile, since the people will refuse to cooperate with their new master. The point related to heedfulness for the ruler is, war is like medicine. It can cure or it can kill. you must be as clear as possible on whether it will benefit the people before taking action. Confucius also understood that not only the ruler has to be heedful in making decisions about war, his ministers need to be able to do so in order to advise the ruler properly. Late in his life, two of Confucius's disciples were working for the Ji clan, the same powerful family from which the individual who tried to gift Confucius medicine came. The disciples reported that the family planned to attack a small and weak neighboring state called Zhuanyu. He admonished them for not doing more to stop this, and explained before any attack occurred, the family needed to get their own house in order. Here's Pei Menni's translation of the relevant part of the passage. If remote people are not submissive, then cultivate culture and virtue to attract them. Once they come over, make them secure. Now you two disciples, in assisting your master, cannot attract remote people when they are not submissive, cannot preserve the state when it is falling apart. Instead, you plan to use military forces within the state. I am afraid that the trouble of the family you serve lies not in Zhuanyu, where you plan to attack, but within the screen walls of its own court. In other words, it's the responsibility of these disciples to guide their ruler to the correct decision, and in this case, the right decision is to get their own house in order before causing trouble somewhere else. Last of all, Confucius was concerned that waging war might be done at the wrong time. Just like you wouldn't exercise at the expense of sleep, war cannot be waged in a way that prevents the basic needs of the people from being met. Here's a section of Slingerland's translation of passage 1.5. To guide a state of 1,000 chariots, employ the common people only at the proper times. For context, a state of 1,000 chariots was considered a medium-sized state at that time. Employing the common people only at the proper times meant mainly that a ruler should never take the farmers away from their land during the growing season, especially for the purposes of fighting a war. The reason is that interrupting the people during this critical period causes them financial ruin by depriving them of their livelihood, starvation by causing the crops to fail, and injury and death by putting them on the battlefield. To carelessly cause any one of those three things is enough to be called unheedful. Now let's move on to the final item on this list, Jai. What exactly is Jai? 6 out of 7 translations render it as fasting, but I chose ritual cleansing and sided closer to the 7th. What's wrong with fasting? Let's focus on the most common meaning of fasting, which is abstaining from eating or from consumption of specific foods. That's one element of Jai, but there's much more to it. So Burton Watson's rendition, which is preparations for a sacrifice, seems much more appropriate to me. In many religious traditions, fasting refers to a variety of activities. One example is fasting during the holy month of Ramadan, which requires Muslims to abstain from food, drink, and sexual activity during daylight hours. The Chinese fast also had multiple abstinences and related practices. This included abstaining from eating meat and pungent vegetables like onions and garlic, abstaining from drinking alcohol, abstaining from sexual intercourse and entertainment activities, plus moving from one's normal bedroom to a more secluded room, bathing, and wearing clean clothes. Some more involved forms of Jai would require even further isolation to prepare for the ritual. All of these preparations were completed with the goal of focusing the participant's mind, body, and soul on the ritual to be conducted, what Neo-Confucian great Zhu Xi called alignment. Here's what Zhu Xi wrote in his collected commentaries. The word jai means to align. When preparing to offer a sacrifice, one must align and bring order to those thoughts and cares that are scattered and disorderly in order to commune with the spirits. Whether one's sincerity reaches its utmost or falls short, and whether the spirits accept the offering or reject it, all depend entirely upon this. So, did a sacrifice participant need to be especially heedful in ritual cleansing? For sure. If you've listened to episode 16, you'll remember 3.12. If I am not fully present at the sacrifice, it is as if I did not sacrifice at all. And if a participant's mind and body are not fully prepared for the sacrifice, how could they be fully present when participating in it? Among the 3 topics listed in passage 7.13, ritual cleansing is the broadest, the least personal, and the most abstract. While Confucius placed profound importance in ritual, he advocated starting with the personal and working up to the spiritual. In passage 11.12, his disciple Zilu asked how to serve the spirits. His response was simple. If you can't yet serve the people, how can you serve the spirits? And then to drive the point home, he said, if you don't yet understand life, how can you understand death? I want to wrap up this section on interpretation of the passage by mentioning how much I discovered while I was preparing it. I started off with what I thought would be an easy one. Like I said at the beginning, in a lot of ways, this is a very straightforward statement. But as soon as I realized I'd need to understand the virtue of shèn before it all made sense, things got complicated. I wrestled with at least 3 translations before I settled on heedful, and I'm still not sure it's much better than choosing careful or cautious. And while it made sense intuitively that people take extra care in dealing with illness, warfare, and ritual cleansing, the threads that tied them together just weren't there at first. At least, it wasn't obvious to me that these 3 topics could be taken at different levels of the same type of concern. I'm glad I made those connections, and I hope you are too. Remember, exemplary persons cultivate the root. For having the root established, the way will grow. In terms of language, there's not much we haven't already discussed at length in this passage, so I'll cover just one grammatical point, and then I'll give you a look at a line from the collected commentaries I reference most often, Cheng Shude's work, 论语集释, or collected commentaries on the analects. 7.13 begins with the characters 子之所慎, and this subject, 之所, verb construct, is what builds the beginning of the phrase. It basically just means that which. So another way to translate it is that which the master was heedful of. We still see 之所 in modern Mandarin. You may have studied 之所以, which is a slightly fancy way of saying the reason for which. And just like in classical Chinese, you put the subject at the beginning. Takes a little getting used to. Last up, let's look at that passage from the collected commentaries that I mentioned. It's a short one. 机节孔曰此三者人所不能胜而夫子 独能胜之. First, the title in brackets is the name of a work. 论语集解. That work is from the Eastern Han, completed around 250 CE, and itself is a collection of the interpretations of many of the earliest Confucian scholars. One such commentator was named Kong An Guo, who lived in the 1st century BCE and was an 11th generation descendant of Confucius. So Kong Yue refers to a statement by Kong An Guo about this passage. What he writes is, 此三者, these 3 things, referring to ritual cleansing, warfare, and illness. 人所不能胜, were things of which people could not be heedful. Are 夫子独, and only the master, 能胜之, could be heedful of them. In my opinion, it makes a little more sense if you switch up the order a bit in English. What we end up with is, only the master could act heedfully with regards to these 3 things, and others could not be heedful of them. Kong An Guo is pointing out that the reason why Confucius's disciples found his attitude important enough to record in the Analects is that others of their time didn't have the same values, and it caused unnecessary risk to themselves and those around them. All right, folks, that's it for this episode. Don't forget to check out the episode guide on analects.net and visit YouTube to subscribe and like the video edition. Join me next time for a discussion of passage 7.21, another exciting list of 3 things. These are the ones that Confucius didn't want to have conversations about. See you there.